Okay, good morning, Madam Chair, honorable members, professional media, so on, and citizens, and last not least, my precarious friends back there. This is really, I'm not here to rail against the Commission or, to say that everything is terrible and so on, but I do think that we can improve the conditions even more. I'll just mention briefly the Commission's reply, and I sent my reply to their reply around to you by email, as comments on their Word document. I think essentially their replies fall into two categories. On the one side, they simply say, look, in 2013, the legislator decided thus and so. Okay, but that's not a complete reply. It would have to explain why it shouldn't be improved in 2017. And a lot of things happened between 13 and 17, didn't they? And the other thing, of course, is they refute things that we're not even saying. Okay, again, throwing people out after 6 years of practical experience is a huge waste of resources. It's hard to estimate the amount, but it must be thousands of euros for each temporary worker. I want to point out here also that contrary to things that are sort of implied very often, actually the Charter of Fundamental Rights does apply to us who work in the institutions. This came out very clearly in the Strack verdict of the Court of Justice. And the Commission fought desperately, as you see, against Strack and against the idea that their own people should have the rights enshrined in the Charter. And as you see here, they lost very badly after 2 appeals. What you see there on the screen, it's the equivalent of a spanking by the court. I mean, this is when the court says you have to pay all your own costs and you have to pay the other guy's costs. This is, slap, slap. So the court really decided very clearly. Okay, another little bit of legal background is the fixed-term work directive, which, of course, on paper it's addressed to the member states to legislate, and the Commission can say, oh, we're not a member state. However, how can you explain that it applies to everybody else, but not to the one who helped draft the directive, who helped create it? And how can you, above all, explain that these principles in the directive don't apply to your own workers? I don't think you can really explain that. And it's very, very clear, the fixed-term directive, fixed-term people get everything that the non-fixed, the open-ended get, except where you have to go pro rata. Oh, good grief. Okay, above all, for an example, fixed-term workers, of course, should get an equal chance at obtaining a steady job. They shouldn't have, they shouldn't be discriminated against, which is just the opposite, of course, of what the Commission says. The Commission says, oh, no, we must never give them the same rights in any area. We must always, push them down a little lower. We must maintain our caste system. And I really want to appeal slightly here, almost emotionally, think of what it means to be on a fixed-term contract, and to know that the clock is running just like for me. And you know the exact date when you will be unemployed. And it doesn't matter. You could win an unshared Nobel Prize. They still kick you out. Okay, the second main point of the petition, the main point, of course, is please let's stop this nonsense of sacking people after 6 years, even when they perform very, very well. Sometimes they perform better than the ones who sacked them. The other thing that we would like is, please, let's really open the internal competitions to our fixed-term colleagues. We made some steps, just thanks to your committee, with the petition 192. Maybe a few of you even remember me from then. But the Commission continues to sort of stiff-arm us. Okay, I got to hurry here. It's important because the internal competitions have like a 25% success rate, and there have been competitions which much higher ones. So obviously it's a very important right to take part in that. And just generally, oh my goodness, you all know about precarious work and how bad it is for Europe. I don't need to repeat all this. Above all, we're only asking for a little more fairness. We're not even asking in this petition for complete fairness. There you have my contacts. Thank you.
And we thank you very much, and I can assure you that it doesn't happen often that a petitioner gets an applaud just spontaneously like that. That's a bit unusual in this committee. Now I'd like to turn to the Commission representative, and I have several names. You choose who is going first, and if you need to also have one or two of your colleagues to intervene in this case. Please, the floor is yours.
La ringrazio, signora Presidente, onorevoli membri.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, dear Mr. Ashbrook, thank you very much. My name is Roberto Carlini, and I'm the head of unit, the head of the recruitment unit and the Commission. And we have Mr. Rock, who is the head of the legal affairs unit in the DG for Human Resources. Right. I am obviously particularly interested in everything to do with contract agents because I am the person who signs the contracts for contractual agents. And obviously we are very aware of the problems that have been referred to by Mr. Ashbrook, and we are going to do everything in our powers to reply to his questions. Obviously, when we recruit contractual agents, it's in the service, in the interest of the service. The contractual agents were introduced in 2004, so they've been around. This particular type of contract has been around for nearly 15 years, but fixed-term contracts existed before. We had auxiliary agents. This was a contract over a fixed period of time. It was a monthly contract at the time, so there, of course, there was this same notion of a lack of certainty. In 2004, certain changes were made to the structure we have, and we now have the period of a contractual agent has been increased, the maximum from 3 to 6 years. Now, obviously, as of the moment when a person is recruited, they do know the maximum duration of their contract. And now it is quite clear that any contractual agent who wishes to be recruited by the Commission, well, they do know that once the 6 years are over, then the contract comes to an end. So the conditions are transparent and they are correct to everybody who is around the table, if you will. And this serves an interest of the service, the needs of the service, where both parties are concerned. Obviously, we're thinking in terms of the stability of the service, but using these kind of contracts, we can refresh and have a regular updating, if you will, of the skills that are required and the expertise. Sometimes, very often, the levels of skills we require are very high. Whether we're talking about the sector of economics or migration, other sectors affected by the crisis, we do need a high level of skills. This is a need that exists now, it has always existed, and is going to continue to exist in the future. Moving on to the legal aspects of the case here, without going into too much detail, Mr. Rock can give you a little more detail if necessary later on. But I'd just like to say that if we are having recourse to members of staff on a fixed-term contract, we know that these kind of cases have been taken before the courts. And there is one case, C16-2015, Mrs. Perez Lopez against the Madrid Health Services, and the court, when the appeal was brought before it, recalled that not only is it possible for a public institution to recruit and hire people on a fixed term contract, but obviously it has to be in a context, a framework of correctional legality, as we call it, and that we try and respect this. We respect this. So in terms of recruitment, we do this when it comes to the general staff, not only the contractor agents. The Commission has a rule of maximal presence of its temporary agents, its temporary staff. And what we want to avoid is that if you have staff coming in on a temporary basis, knowing they are on a temporary basis, they would stay on too long in a temporary post and perhaps lose sight of what's going on the labour market. And in the case of the appeal, the figures you've given I don't think are correct and don't necessarily tally with the reality, especially when it comes to the number of graduates and the success rate of the internal competition. The most recent internal competition, there were 3,000 candidates, and those who were called for the competition were 80%. 80. In 2014, the legislator allowed the possibility, this on an exceptional basis, and pursuant to Article 82, Paragraph 7, they allowed the access of contractor agents to internal competitions as an extraordinary measure. So it was done then, it could be done in the future, but it is important to note that the internal competitions, the success rate is very similar to the success rate of the external competitions. And it is a means that we have in order to be able to recruit future staff. Thank you very much. And now I'll hand the floor to my colleague for the more legal aspect. A microphone for the chair, please.
Please go ahead with the legal aspects.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Honourable colleagues, honourable members, having listened or following on from the comments made by Mr. Carlini, who has set out the backdrop and what we call the interests of the service concerning the status of officials and contractual agents, it's in the interest of the services to have staff on a fixed term basis. He has explained all of that. I'd just like to make one or two comments on the request submitted by the petitioner. First of all, on implementation of the directive on 1999-70 on fixed term work. This is a framework agreement, if you will, that then was turned into a directive and transposed by the member states. This directive does not directly address the institutions of the European Union. Furthermore, there is a mechanism in our statutes which allows us to directly apply some of the provisions of the directive to our staff, but only in restricted cases when we're talking about health and safety at work. So that constitutes one limitation. But obviously these are not of great importance because the legislator, which is here, together with the council, the co-legislators, the Parliament and the council, that have covered our staff in the most appropriate way and have covered all the elements of protection conferred by the directive. So what the directive is intending to do is to limit the number of precarious and successive contracts. And in Clause 5, there are 3 conditions. These are conditions which are limited and focus specifically on limiting these kind of successive contracts and set a maximum duration to employment. So it comes as a surprise to see that the idea is to do away with the limit of 6 years. And Mr. Carlini has already indicated that the duration was increased from 3 to 6 years. The directive does actually say that there should be a limitation. So whether the directive applies or not, we already see that in their wisdom, the co-legislators have introduced the same level of protection as is granted to all citizens. And I think it's extremely important to highlight that issue. The difference between non-permanent staff and those on a fixed-term contract. The Commission has never denied that the Charter would not directly apply to its agents, nor that the treaty doesn't apply. It applies to all of us. But there is absolutely no reason to say that we cannot apply this difference between the permanent staff and those on fixed-term contracts. There is a recent ruling from the Court of Justice. There are objective reasons one can put forward to justify this distinction. The legislator has included a whole series of reasoning and arguments which are recognised by the court in its jurisdiction. So we do not really understand the sense of the petition, because certain of the elements of the petition run counter to the way that citizens' rights are protected, and there are other aspects that have never been sanctioned by the Court of Justice. Obviously, there has been a considerable improvement in the reform of 2013 with a lot of support from the European Parliament, and that was to allow a kind of passerelle, a bridge, if you will, for the fixed-term contractual agents to the status of permanent staff. This wasn't possible previously because there was an inherent problem, and so there were very few people moving from contractual agents to permanent staff. Contractual agents are paid from the budget, and it means that there is an overall envelope, if you will. There's an amount of money that is made available, and it can be transformed into contracts, if you will. But when it comes to our officials, the permanent members of staff, they are in a staff plan, and if you want to transfer a contractual agent to a fixed post to become a permanent member of staff, then you have to create the post, first of all, and that is something that is not allowed by the budgetary authority present here together with the Council. So we try to facilitate this passage from fixed-term work to a permanent staff, to have this kind of passerelle, as we call it. But then, of course, there are other open competitions which are published to become a member of the staff, to become an official of the institutions. So that on the legal aspects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now let's open the floor to colleagues to participate in this debate. Mr. Valenza first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I certainly don't understand the situation, because we try to keep an eye on the labor laws in the different member states, yet we have the situation in the European Commission where we have the contractual agents, and I understand the distinction between the permanent employees and contractual employees. But we have those contractual employees that have a limit of only 6 years of work in their post. And it doesn't matter if they're good or bad. They can't work for longer than just 6 years. I mean, what's the point? I mean, we train these people. We invest money and time into training these people, and then after 6 years they're let go, and we have to hire new contractual employees, and we have to train them again. And what's the point? So maybe what we should do, we should keep an eye on this. Maybe we should leave this petition open. Maybe we should wait for the next revision of the staff regulation. And as a matter of fact, I think we're going to have a hearing on labor rights in November here in our committee. So maybe let's leave it open, and maybe let's put this on the agenda of that hearing as well. Well, because I certainly don't find the explanation of the committee satisfying.
This also never happens, I tell you. Now, Mrs. Becerra, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I would like to thank Mr. Ashbrook, first of all, for this very lively presentation of his petition. I think all of the groups have agreed to maintain open this petition. In my view, and especially having listened to the Commission, what we're talking about here is not a claim to extend certain deadlines which are set out in a directive. We're talking about consistency here. And as far as I'm concerned, there is a total lack of consistency between the concept as outlined by the Commission and what we're then talking about, referring to the temporary nature of work or precariousness. There seems to be a contradiction in the terms that are used here. First of all, you talk about temporary contracts, whatever kind of post you're talking about, temporary contracts, contractual contracts to replace staff, officials who have a permanent post. And this is what is happening. People are being recruited for a fixed period of time so that officials cannot be recruited because it's not possible. So these people, the contractual agents, are doing work which is permanent in nature, if you will, but on the basis of a fixed-term contract, a contractual agent. And we know that through legislation and various reforms, the duration has been extended. But in the past, it was very limited. We know it was very temporary in nature. But if you have a temporary contract, you say, yes, well, 6 years, that's the maximum duration. How can that be temporary? If you have somebody who is in a post doing a work, doing a job and doing work which is longer term in nature, for a maximum of 6 years, how can that be temporary? In the outside world, then you would have a different understanding of this. And then you say that there is this indication that there's a limitation in time, there's a maximum of 6 years, and that's sort of to do a favour, and that those people who are contracted or recruited like this, well, it's so that they don't lose job opportunities on the private labour market. Well, quite frankly, I think if somebody wants to work for the institutions, they want to develop their professional career in the institutions, it's not because they want to spend a couple of years here to see what goes on here in the institutions, and then they're going on to the private market. So I wouldn't agree with you on that point. Then there was another reply you gave to a question, which is the key point. You said that there are three main conditions that you want to have a geographical balance between large member states and small member states. I don't know why this criterion should have to be introduced on the basis of contractual agents. We're talking about people coming from different places. So that, well, anyway, I don't really understand this aspect of the balance. You want to maintain the general open calls at competitions to recruit staff. And in that case, why are you increasing the number of people recruited on contractual agents? Because if you look at the percentage figures, it's rather difficult to explain these in the way that you have just referred to. We're talking about a petition which talks about, which is aiming at respect of fundamental principles, equal pay for equal work and equal conditions. But we do have to be consistent. You have to be careful about mixing up apples and pears. Why is it that we are recruiting ever more contractual agents? I think then we would have to review our own provisions and basically call a spade a spade.
Mrs. Valina.
Buenos días. Sí, bueno, yo en primer lugar quería dar las gracias.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the petitioner for the excellent presentation he made. And it's surprising that we're here talking about this, that the government of the EU, the Commission, I mean, that's basically the government of the EU, has up to 20% of its workers under this statute of contractual agent, which is basically temporary workers. I think this is unheard of for an institution which pretends to fulfill the rules and the standards. It is not providing an example to follow. I think internal rules exclude these people who for 6 years have been trained, have acquired knowledge and responsibility and skills, and they're not able to compete in the same conditions as other workers. in addition to being illogical from a labor point of view, it's also from an economic point of view, because we're talking about the cost of training of these workers, which is only amortized over time. I mean, we're talking about public money here. I mean, with so many cuts everywhere, we're wasting public money doing this. I think the European Commission is not fulfilling a basic principle, and that is non-discrimination. So the minimum we should do is study the case in depth and see how we can change the rules and look at the staff conditions in these institutions. And I would make the same proposal as my colleague before me. And that is that we leave it open and we study this at the hearing we'll be holding on precariousness of jobs, because I think here is where we should start by leading by example.
Thank you. Mrs. Evi.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I'm delighted with my colleagues' comments who spoke before me on this petition. I really do want to thank the petitioner for presenting this, and I support him. I want to state that clearly from my side as well. Big support for this petition, because it highlights a very serious problem which continues even in the European institutions. It's a fact that contractual agents are equivalent in terms of functions to temporary agents and officials in the EU, and very often they carry out a major part of the work done in the institutions. I mean, they're one of the pillars of the work being done within the whole institution. What has put this in crisis is the principle of non-discrimination, and this has exposed them to either unemployment or discrimination, because this is happening, and we need to take care of that. We also need to look at the model of good administration. I would almost say that there's no that you would lose the intention of working well and working in the service of the European citizens. I mean, our work in the institutions needs to be done for the benefit of the citizens, and if we can't do that, if this system continues. I very much agree with what my colleagues have said. And I think this petition should remain open. It would be an excellent opportunity to include this on the agenda, as others have said, of the hearing that we'll be organizing in November, precisely because this issue will be looked at and it needs to be sorted out as soon as possible, and we shouldn't waste any more time to do this. So again, thanks to the petitioner and colleagues for keeping this petition open. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the floor goes to Mrs. Curtin-Darling.
Thanks very much. My apologies to the petitioner for missing the petition. I got stuck in a crash, but I'm glad to hear all of my colleagues basically stating similar position to mine. I would just add, last week in Strasbourg, the European Parliament adopted a resolution on precarious work and working conditions. And I think not only do we need to call on the European Commission to walk the walk and not just talk the talk about reducing precarious work in Europe, but we also need to do that job in the European Parliament. And so I fully support the idea of keeping the petition open, and also Mr. Valenza's idea of adding it to the hearing that we have in November around precarious work. I think it's clear that we should be pushing for more stability in the workplace and in working conditions and in contracts. All of the evidence shows that stability in working conditions leads to a net benefit for society in terms of healthy workplaces, in terms of psychosocial health of the workers, and therefore we should really be seeing this as a long-term investment, as well as all of the other reasons we're training people and then losing people and losing all that investment. But there's a health dimension to tackling precarious forms of work as well. And the final point would just be to remember that this Petitions Committee has actually been right at the forefront of this fight for a number of years. It was a petition in 2009 which allowed contract agents access for internal competitions. We've been fighting for these workers for a long time. I don't think we should give up that fight now, and we should be looking at how we can improve the situation for contract workers when the next review of the staff regulations come up. But my main point is that if we're going to adopt resolutions around precarious work, then we need to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Danoka.
Yes, thank you. I don't want to repeat the arguments used by my colleagues, but I fully share them to support the petition. And we know that we have always problems with reference to the Charter on Fundamental Rights by the reason of Article 51, which says that gives the restrictions only to the cases of EU competence, but here we have just the case where we examine the case fully under EU competence. So we can fully refer to the Charter and prohibition of discrimination, etc., etc. My proposal would be to our decision, since I am a representative of Petitions Committee in the Employment Committee for Petitions Network, proposal is to send this petition to the Employment Committee. I am ready to present it there. And for the hearings in November, I'm not very much aware. It will be joined with some committee or not? If it is joined, but it would be very good to have them together with employment. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the list of colleagues that would like to intervene on this topic. And I'm happy to extend the floor again to you, Mr. Ashbrook, for final 2 minutes.
Well, there isn't time, of course, to in detail refute what the colleagues from the Commission said, but I'm issuing an open challenge here. If you like, we go in a room somewhere with a video camera and we'll have a debate, equal speaking time, and we'll go through it point by point. And if you don't take up my challenge, I'm going to put a little video out stating that and saying, ha, they're afraid. Look, if you look at Article 1 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, human dignity, how can you square these practices with human dignity? And then, don't you understand that people who have precarious jobs are not even really full citizens? Don't you see that we're on a slippery slope, an inclined slope with lots of soap on it, you know, going back towards chattel slavery? Except this time we're using the opposite method. You know, instead of chaining workers to the oars in the galley, now we're threatening to throw them overboard if they don't row fast enough, our slaves. And the horrible thing is here, we throw the galley slave to the sharks after 6 years, you know, because we want a new one. But after 6 years, he's just got big fat muscles. He's especially good at rowing. So for economic reasons and pragmatic reasons, but really also for ethical reasons, for reasons of kindness. Yes, I'm asking you to support this petition, and please also, of course, make sure that the Leggi Committee knows about it so that they can build it into the next staff regulation the way we did with 192 back in 2011. Thank you so much. You've really made my day here, people. You've really made me happy.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, then it's up to me to try to conclude and summarize this. What I think we should do is that we turn to the Legal Affairs Committee for an opinion on this case. I was in the Legal Affairs Committee when we did the staff regulation last time. I was even the shadow for Mrs. Roth-Behrendt, and I remember it's not that long time ago, but maybe the Legal Affairs Committee should look into this, and this is what we can do. And also include the topic of this petition into the hearing that you are organizing on the 22nd of November. And that's what we do with this. I think, of course, we keep the petition open. That goes without saying. Okay. We can, of course, send it to the ENVI Committee for information, to the Employment Committee for information. Of course, we can do that. And then we move on to the next